start with today is to acknowledge here in my office at Columbia Self-Storage that I've decorated for the holiday. I have some of this cute little corn and a really nice little pumpkin, bringing the holidays home here in my office for office hours and today's session on critical race theory. Today, what I want to talk about is one of the topics that critical race theory scholars engaged really from the very beginning, and I think continues to have resonance today as affirmative action, DEI, and other measures like that are being rolled back. And that is the question of, what does it mean to have a race? What makes up race? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be black? How do we define who's white, who's black? And critical race scholars weighed in on this very early because the stakes in the United States have been incredibly high from the very beginning of this country, in fact, before the founding of the country. And so where does this issue come up? Well, certainly with respect to who could be enslaved, black people could be enslaved, white people could not. After the Civil War, with Jim Crow segregation, who went to what schools, could be born in which hospitals, could own property, could testify in court, where were you supposed to sit in the waiting room for a bus or a train, in which car or which part of the bus were you to sit, who could be served in what businesses, because some businesses, of course, were whites only. So the definition of race has been critically important to all manner of public, but also private life. Who could you marry? The statute in the Commonwealth of Virginia that was invalidated in the 1970s by the Supreme Court that regulated who could marry whom based on race said that only white people could marry white people. They could not marry somebody who wasn't white. So we have many, many contexts in which the question of who is white and who is not, or more importantly, what does it mean to have a race? What sort of test should we use to determine a person's race, have been critical to really every aspect of our society. So I want to highlight several critical race scholars who have really done important thinking on this issue. Ian Haney Lopez, Ariela Gross, Neil Gotanda, John Calmore. These are just a few who have written some of the most important work in this area. Many people don't know this, but between 1790 and 1952, only white people could be naturalized as citizens. So could by law be made into a U.S. citizen. So of course it was critically important who was white and who wasn't. What test should we use? And then comes the even harder question of how do we deal with Asian people, with Chinese, with Japanese, with other Asian people? Are they white? If skin color is the only issue, absolutely they're white. But of course, many people would argue that Asian people are a different race than are white people. What about Latinos? In 1848, the U.S. entered into a treaty with Mexico in which it bought 52% of the country of Mexico and incorporated it into the United States, what became California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, parts of Arizona and Colorado. Were those people living in that territory who prior to 1848 were Mexicans, and then at least the territory was part of the United States, did they become U.S. citizens? And that treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, says that the people living there who had been previously Mexican were white so that they could be naturalized. Now today we don't think of Latinos, or not everybody does necessarily, as white, but the law, the treaty, did the work of declaring them white for the purposes certainly of naturalization as U.S. citizens in the mid-19th century. So much is at stake here. Certainly, who you can marry, whether you can be a citizen, whether you can be enslaved, but also just going back to the discussion I had a few weeks ago about Cheryl Harris's work and the issues of whiteness as property, the kind of idea that she offered. The question of who is white and who is not is critically important to who can access the privileges of whiteness in this society and who cannot. So as we look at, through Ian Haney Lopez's work, White by Law, Ariela Gross's book, What Blood Won't Tell. Both of those important books looked historically at what courts used to determine a person's race. Is it something that you can just tell by looking? But of course, there are people who can pass, that even that concept says that perhaps our visual sense of a person's race is not reliable. And if that's the case, what is? Should we use a scientific test? And as all of these scholars noted, in the United States, we had a rule that was called the rule of hypodescent, that if you had 1 drop of black blood in your ancestry, you could not claim title to whiteness. So is that a blood test? Of course not. There's no such thing as testing for race or testing for black blood. Black blood and white blood are the same blood. Courts struggled with how to define whiteness, what tests they should use, what tests they could use that would be reliable. Is it common knowledge? Is it intuition? Or is it a scientific test? And they went back and forth. And as Gross's book describes, What Blood Won't Tell, the court started out with this notion of scientific tests, but of course there isn't one, and ended up defaulting to a kind of common sense notion of whatever the understanding of the common man or the common person was about what it meant to be white. That would be the test that would be used. And what's incredible about the cases that she looks at is that courts would, for instance, in determining whether someone could be enslaved in the antebellum period, they would certify slave owners and slavers as experts who would come in and testify to the court about the color or the texture of the palm of a person's hand or the bottom of their foot. As an expert, they said, I can tell whether this person is black or not and therefore enslavable because I've been around a lot of black people as an enslaver. I mean, today that is such an offensive notion by any measure. But this is what happened quite often in courts, was the certification as experts of enslavers by just looking at somebody, even if otherwise their phenotype it was not obvious. There was something maybe not visible to the regular eye, but to the eye of the expert that would reveal that 1 drop of blood on the outside of your hand. So too, things would, the kinds of evidence that the courts would use was what kind of hospital were you born in? Was your mother born in? Was your grandparents born in? Because hospitals, of course, were segregated for so much of our country's history. So if your mother was born or you were born in a colored or black hospital, that would be evidence of your race. What schools did you go to? What church did you go to? All of the legalities of Jim Crow segregation became facts about a person's race that could, or a person's ancestor's race, that would help determine what your race was. So these are social facts, not scientific facts. They're about who you associated with, where you associated, where you were segregated by law. That would determine what race you were. John Calmore, who is also an important critical race theorist, has written, critical race theory begins with a recognition that race is not a fixed term. Its terms are determined within the frame of white supremacy. Whiteness exists not only as the opposite of non-whiteness, but as the superior opposite. And this insight, I think, is critically important, is that this very question of what race you have only takes place within a society that is structured around white superiority and non-white inferiority, because the stakes are so high. And again, to go back to Harris's idea of property and whiteness, it is the project of excluding those who are trespassing on whiteness and its privileges that requires the kind of inquiry that these cases and these courts are going into. Lastly, you read Ian Haney Lopez's work, and he actually recommends at the end of his book, because of the stakes for white supremacy, of asking this very question, what race do you have and at what point can you lose title to whiteness as some person who's not white? He says what the whites should do is renounce their racial identity as it is currently constituted in the interests of social justice. So it's an interesting thing to ask the people who inhabit either by law or by social recognition, the more privileged category of whiteness, we should renounce that, surrender it, give back title to it as a social justice project in order to diminish the value, the superior value of whiteness itself. I think it's a really interesting concept. Last thing I want to say about this is to note the relevance, and maybe some relevance, for questions today about trans people. What does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? What tests should we use? Right? Science doesn't answer this question because science can give us a bunch of different answers. Not any one of them is necessarily definitive. Also, too, one's sex may be as much a cultural or social concept as it is a scientific concept. And so it's interesting to look back at these race cases to see how courts and society more generally have struggled with who is white, who is not, and see to what degree does that kind of parallel or perhaps is different from the question of who is male and who is female, and whether these are questions that can be answered or should be answered scientifically or culturally, or whether those people who are cisgendered ought to surrender their cis identity as a form of solidarity, surrendering of their privilege as a form of solidarity with trans people, with people who are intersex, with people who are gender nonconforming, who don't really sign up for or fit at all in a gender-based binary. So these readings from Ian Haney Lopez, Ariela Gross, Neil Gotanda, John Calmore, and many others are really critically important, I think, for their own sake and thinking about whiteness, but they also bear some very interesting, I think, relationships to how we think about sex and gender too, to what extent the parallel bears out and maybe runs out. But this is one of the critical contributions that the critical race theorists have given us, is an inquiry into the natural category of race and how white supremacy rests so heavily on the assumed naturalness of racial identity when in fact it's not so natural at all. Take care.